Picture this. It's 9 p.m. on a warm Florida Thursday. The Atlantic breeze is steady. Tourists in Cocoa Beach are winding down their nights. Locals are watching television, maybe half asleep in their chairs. And then, in the space of a single heartbeat, the sky turns orange. Not the soft orange of a sunset, not the lazy flicker of a distant fire, a violent, sudden second sunrise, the kind of light that makes your brain stall because it simply does not belong there at that hour in that sky. Windows rattle, floors shake, people who were half asleep sit bolt upright, and miles away, on a pad at Cape Canaveral, a 321-foot rocket called New Glenn, one of the most powerful machines ever assembled on American soil, simply ceases to exist. Blue Origin just lost more than a rocket. They lost the only place on Earth they had left to launch one. If that kind of story, where a single night rewrites months of history, where one explosion sends ripples across space programs, government contracts, and the race to the moon, if that makes your brain catch fire in the best possible way, stay with us. We go deeper every week. Now let's talk about what actually happened, because the press releases have been very, very careful about what they've chosen not to say. Thursday, May 28th, was supposed to be routine. The word routine will feel painfully ironic by the time we're through. What Blue Origin had planned for that night was a static fire test, one of the most standard checkpoints in rocket preparation. The engines ignite while the rocket stays bolted to the ground. They burn for a few seconds. Engineers watch the data stream in, looking for anything that feels wrong. If everything looks clean, you proceed to launch. Nothing dramatic, a checkbox, a rehearsal for the real thing. New Glenn's fourth mission, designated NG-4, was scheduled for June 4th, just 1 week away. The cargo waiting in a Florida clean room was a payload of 48 Amazon LEO satellites, the opening move in a $10 billion bet Jeff Bezos has made on building a satellite internet network to challenge SpaceX's Starlink. Launch one of what was supposed to be a long, choreographed sequence, the starting gun in a race years in the making. Then, somewhere in those few seconds of that test firing, something went catastrophically, irreversibly wrong, and when the smoke cleared, there was nothing left to launch. The thing the official statement skipped past, and they did skip past it, carefully, with the kind of language that conveys exactly what it chooses to conceal, is the specific nature of what was destroyed. Because Launch Complex 36, the pad where New Glenn was sitting, was not simply a launch pad, it was the only orbital launch pad Blue Origin had anywhere in the world. Let that sit for a moment. Not a backup, not a secondary facility, the only one. Blue Origin spent over $1 billion rebuilding Launch Complex 36 from the ground up, completing the work in 2021. The original pad dates back to 1962, built to launch the Atlas Centaur rocket, and over 6 decades it had hosted 148 launches. Blue Origin demolished the old structures and raised something entirely new in their place. A massive, purpose-built complex engineered specifically around the size, weight, and fueling requirements of New Glenn. The first newly constructed launch complex at Cape Canaveral since the 1960s. A single, irreplaceable piece of infrastructure that the entire New Glenn program depended upon. Gone in under a minute. The 188-foot first stage, filled with liquid methane and liquid oxygen, ignited at its base. The upper stage above it began to tilt, and then the whole stack, the rocket, the fuels, all of it, went up together in a single, enormous event. The transporter erector, the massive scaffold that holds New Glenn upright and rolls it from its assembly hangar to the pad, was standing right beside it, gone. At least one of the lightning protection towers, the tall steel masts that ring the pad like ancient sentinels, was vaporized. By Friday morning, Blue Origin was warning beachgoers across the Florida coast that debris from the explosion might wash ashore in the coming days. Homes in Cape Canaveral and Cocoa Beach shook from the blast. Residents watching television felt the floor move beneath them. The orange glow was visible from highways miles inland. To understand the scale of what just happened, it helps to have a reference point. The last comparable event at Cape Canaveral was September 2016. A SpaceX Falcon 9 sitting on Pad 40, a fueling operation that spiraled out of control, a fireball that consumed the rocket, and an expensive Israeli communications satellite riding on top. The Falcon 9 fleet was grounded for 3.5 months. The pad itself was out of commission for more than a year. That explosion was significant, damaging, expensive. It set SpaceX back. But here is the critical difference. SpaceX had options. They moved launches to Pad 39A at Kennedy Space Center. They used Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. They kept flying. Their entire launch cadence didn't stop. It just rerouted. Because SpaceX had built redundancy into its infrastructure, multiple pads, multiple sites, multiple paths forward. Blue Origin does not have options. Until Launch Complex 36 is rebuilt, every New Glenn that currently exists, and everyone still being assembled, has no place to go. Now the consequences start to cascade, and they cascade quickly. Start with Amazon, because Amazon is now in serious, uncomfortable trouble, the kind that doesn't resolve itself quickly and doesn't respond well to press releases. Their satellite internet business, Project Kuiper, which they've been building as a direct competitor to SpaceX's Starlink, depends entirely on getting satellites into orbit fast. Not eventually, now. Starlink already has more than 7,600 satellites operating in low Earth orbit, serving over 10 million subscribers. Amazon, by the most generous count, had between 210 and 241 satellites in orbit before Thursday night. The Federal Communications Commission, the agency that issues the licenses that make satellite businesses legally operational, requires Amazon to place 1,618 satellites into orbit by July 30th, 2026. That is 2 months from now. Amazon has already filed for a 2-year extension, but even with that extension, the math is brutal. The 24 New Glenn launches they contracted with Blue Origin were the backbone of the deployment plan. NG-4 was supposed to be Launch 1. There is no Launch 1 anymore. The first 48 satellites, thankfully, were not aboard during the static fire test, which stands as the solitary piece of good news in this entire story. But the other 23 contracted launches are now sitting in limbo, waiting for a pad that doesn't exist, while a regulatory deadline moves closer, with complete indifference to what happened at Cape Canaveral on Thursday night. Imagine being Andy Jassy for a moment. You run one of the largest companies in the world. You've committed to building a global satellite network. You've spent $10 billion to do it. Your single biggest launch partner, the company responsible for the majority of your orbital delivery capability, is owned by the man who founded the company you now run. You've spent years coordinating launch schedules, building satellite factories, training ground operations teams. You've synchronized the most complex logistical puzzle in commercial spaceflight. And then, on a Thursday night, while you're in Seattle, your phone lights up with a live stream from Florida. A massive fireball, your biggest launch partner's only pad, engulfed. That was Andy Jassy's Thursday night, but the satellites are almost a secondary concern compared to what else hangs in the balance, because 2 days before the explosion, on May 26th and 27th, NASA announced a package of contracts worth nearly $1 billion for its moon base program. Buried deep in that announcement was a name that will now carry the weight of an entirely different kind of significance: Blue Origin. The contract was worth $188 million, with an option period adding another $280 million. The mission: deliver 2 lunar terrain vehicles to the moon's south pole. The rovers that will roll across dust where Apollo never reached. The wheels that will leave the first American tracks on the lunar surface in over 50 years. Blue Origin won that contract. They earned it. And the lander that will carry those rovers, the Blue Moon Mark 1, launches on top of a New Glenn. The same New Glenn that is now scattered in pieces across Cape Canaveral. On Friday morning, NASA Administrator Jared Isaacman posted a measured statement. He said the agency was aware of the anomaly. He said they would work with partners to support a thorough investigation. He said, and this line has been repeated often, that spaceflight is unforgiving. What he did not say is worth listening to very carefully. He did not say that the Artemis 3 low Earth orbit demonstration of the Blue Moon lander, scheduled for mid-2027, depends on New Glenn. He did not say that the Moonbase 1 mission, targeted for the fall of this year, depends on New Glenn. He did not say that Artemis 4, the mission that will actually return American astronauts to the lunar surface in 2028, depends on Blue Moon to land them. He did not say that the entire architecture of America's return to the moon flows through this rocket. He didn't have to. The math says it for him. There is another problem hiding inside the smoke, and this one has implications that stretch well beyond Blue Origin. It's called the BE-4. The BE-4 is the engine that powers New Glenn's first stage. 7 of them bolt to the bottom of the rocket, each one producing approximately 640,000 pounds of thrust at sea level. They burn liquid methane mixed with liquid oxygen in what engineers call an oxygen-rich staged combustion cycle, one of the most efficient and most mechanically complex propulsion techniques ever developed. These engines are powerful, technically sophisticated, and relatively new to spaceflight. They are also, critically, the same engines that power United Launch Alliance's Vulcan Centaur rocket. 2 engines per Vulcan instead of 7, but the same hardware, the same design, the same manufacturer. And the BE-4 has a history that warrants careful attention. The engine was first announced in 2014. It didn't fly until 2024, a decade of development, plagued with technical setbacks and repeated delays. On June 30th, 2023, a BE-4 engine exploded 10 seconds into a ground test, damaging the test stand. Blue Origin investigated, made changes, and eventually got the engine certified. The first Vulcan launch in January 2024 was a success. The maiden flight of New Glenn followed a year later, also a success. The engines have worked, but they have also exploded before, on the ground, during exactly the kind of static fire test that just destroyed Launch Complex 36. If the ongoing investigation determines that a BE-4 engine failure caused Thursday's explosion, the Vulcan Centaur program has a serious problem of its own. Vulcan carries critical national security payloads for the Department of Defense. Space Force satellites, spy satellites, missile warning systems, the kinds of missions the United States government absolutely cannot afford to delay on. A BE-4 grounding wouldn't just stop Blue Origin, it would put America's entire primary heavy-lift launch capability into question at once. The publication Spaceflight Now, which covers the launch industry more closely than anyone, raised exactly that question within hours of the explosion. The investigation hasn't blamed the engines yet. The investigation hasn't blamed anything yet, because the root cause is still being pieced together from telemetry data and the molten remains of a launch pad. But every hour that passes without a definitive answer keeps that worst-case scenario alive on the table. This was not the first warning sign, not even close. Blue Origin's third New Glenn flight, on April 19th, ended with a stranded satellite. The mission was called Bluebird 7, carrying a spacecraft built by AST Space Mobile, a company developing space-based cell towers designed to beam mobile phone service directly from orbit to ordinary devices on the ground. The satellite was ambitious, expensive, and irreplaceable. The first stage flew beautifully and even landed itself on a drone ship in the Atlantic, exactly the kind of capability Blue Origin has been fighting to demonstrate, because reusable first stages are the only realistic path to competing with SpaceX on launch cost. But then, the upper stage failed. A cryogenic leak, liquid oxygen, cold enough to freeze almost anything it touches, leaked somewhere it was never supposed to be. It froze a hydraulic line solid. Without that hydraulic line, the engine couldn't properly gimbal, couldn't steer the thrust. The satellite released into an orbit that no one wanted, drifting in a trajectory where it couldn't perform a single function it was designed for. An expensive machine, built to connect people, stranded uselessly in the wrong piece of sky. The FAA grounded New Glenn, ordered a full investigation, identified 9 corrective actions, and cleared the rocket to return to flight on May 27th. That date is worth circling. May 27th, the FAA's final sign-off. New Glenn officially cleared to fly again. Less than 36 hours later, the rocket was burning on the pad. The FAA, technically speaking, is not investigating Thursday's explosion. Static fire tests fall outside the scope of FAA-licensed launch activities. Air traffic wasn't affected. That is what the agency will tell you. What they won't volunteer is that they had just cleared a rocket whose engines had not yet been tested as a complete stack on the actual launch pad. Thursday night, those engines answered that particular question for everyone, dramatically and permanently. We don't yet know what caused the failure. It could have been an engine. It could have been a propellant system, a valve, a software issue, a structural problem with the pad infrastructure, or some combination of factors that interacted in a way no individual component test would have revealed. We may not know for months, Blue Origin will run the investigation. Blue Origin will determine the root cause. And until that investigation completes and produces a publicly verifiable conclusion, LC-36 cannot be cleared for any further operations. The best case recovery timeline, based on what happened to SpaceX after the 2016 Pad 40 explosion, is approximately 1 year before Launch Complex 36 can host another rocket. That's the optimistic scenario. Worst case is longer, considerably longer, and during all of that time, New Glenn has no other place to fly. There is no Plan B pad, there is only LC-36. Let's anchor the scale of what that means for the business. Blue Origin had planned between 8 and 12 New Glenn launches in 2026. SpaceX, by comparison, has between 140 and 145 launches planned for the same year. That gap was already staggering before Thursday night. Now, conservatively, every remaining Blue Origin launch on the 2026 calendar has effectively been erased in a single event. Blue Origin, as a company, carries a valuation of around $100 billion. SpaceX is preparing for a public offering at a valuation estimated somewhere between $1.75 and $2 trillion. The markets are not sentimental. They will not wait politely while a pad gets rebuilt. A single New Glenn flight costs somewhere between $68 million and $110 million, depending on how you account for development amortization. The entire New Glenn program has cost Blue Origin at least $2.5 billion to reach this point. On Thursday night, in roughly 30 seconds, a significant chunk of that investment disappeared. Not just the rocket, the pad itself, the transporter erector, the supporting infrastructure, the launch slot, the customer confidence, the forward momentum, all of it gone in a fire that lasted less than a minute. Jeff Bezos posted a statement on Friday morning. It was short, careful, and composed. All personnel were accounted for and safe, he wrote. It was too early to know the root cause, but they were already working to find it. A very rough day, but they would rebuild whatever needed rebuilding and get back to flying. It's worth it, he wrote. It is a calm statement, the kind you produce after spending 2 hours alone in a room with your own thoughts before putting a single word on paper. Then Elon Musk responded, 7 words, most unfortunate, rockets are hard. Which is true, it is completely, technically true, rockets are hard. But it was also the response of a man who had just watched his biggest competitor lose its only launch pad on live television in front of millions of viewers and chose to answer with 7 words. You can feel the weight of that economy of language. Here is what's worth dwelling on when you think about the physical reality of what happened Thursday night. A fully fueled New Glenn first stage carries hundreds of thousands of gallons of liquid methane and liquid oxygen. When that mixture ignites all at once, not in the controlled, directed burn of a successful launch, but in the uncontrolled, simultaneous ignition of an explosion, the chemical energy released is enough to vaporize anything within hundreds of feet. NASA, the FAA, and the Space Force have spent years carefully studying the explosion radius of methane-oxygen propellant combinations at this scale, precisely because vehicles like New Glenn, Starship, and Vulcan all use similar chemistry, and an accident on one pad could potentially damage neighboring infrastructure. If you had been standing a mile away from LC-36 on Thursday night, the thermal pulse would have hit your face like an oven door thrown open. If you had been standing on the pad itself, there would have been nothing left to find. That is how much compressed, structured chemical fury was sitting inside that rocket. That is the force that humans were planning to strap into a controlled burn and ride upward through the atmosphere 1 week from now. The fact that every person on the Blue Origin team is accounted for and safe is not a footnote. It is the most important sentence in the entire story. So what comes next? Blue Origin will rebuild. That part is not in doubt. Bezos has the resources, and he said as much. The pad will be reconstructed. The investigation will eventually find a cause. Engineers will redesign whatever needs redesigning, recertify whatever needs certifying, and at some point, in some month of some year, a New Glenn will roll out to a rebuilt LC-36 and attempt this again. That is how spaceflight works. You fail, you analyze, you fix, you fly. It is the only path forward, and Blue Origin will walk it because there is no other road available. But there is a wider context here that nobody at Blue Origin will say out loud right now, and it deserves to be said clearly. The American launch industry has consolidated dramatically. The United States effectively has two heavy-lift launch providers, SpaceX and Blue Origin. The Department of Defense, NASA, Amazon, and every commercial satellite operator that needs orbital access all depend on one of those two companies. When one of them loses its only launch pad on what should have been a routine night, the entire American launch architecture, military, scientific, and commercial, wobbles. Not collapses, wobbles. But that wobble matters. Vulcan Centaur depends on the same BE-4 engines. Artemis depends on Blue Moon. Amazon depends on New Glenn. National security depends on a diversified set of launch options that don't all intersect at the same critical failure point. Thursday night exposed exactly how thin that redundancy actually is. How much of America's access to orbit rests on so few machines, so few pads, so few teams. Now we arrive at the piece of the story that carries the most long-term weight. The Moon. The first crewed Artemis mission was originally supposed to land on the Moon in 2024. Then it slipped to 2025, then 2026. The current target is 2028. Every one of those delays happened before Thursday night, before any of the consequences of this explosion had entered the picture. The Artemis program was already running behind, already absorbing years of schedule slip from factors that had nothing to do with Blue Origin. Now imagine the pressure bearing down on that 2028 target when one of the program's primary contractors is rebuilding its launch infrastructure from scratch. At the same time, consider what's happening on the other side of the world. China's space program has announced a target date for its first crewed lunar mission, 2030. And unlike the American program, the Chinese timeline has not been accumulating delays. Tiangong, their space station, is built and continuously crewed. They have successfully landed robotic missions on the far side of the Moon, something the United States has never done. They have a functioning lunar lander program, the Long US spacecraft, with tested engines. They are building toward 2030 with a methodical, well-resourced momentum that does not depend on American hardware, American engines, or American launch pads. They build their own. They launch from their own facilities at Wenchang and Jiuquan. Their timeline bends to their own infrastructure, and their infrastructure is not currently smoking on a Florida beach.